All right, so like Reconstruction, the Progressive Era did not accomplish everything that it set out to do. Um, there were some improvements in social and economic policy, but the U.S. paid, as a federal government, they paid very little attention to the well being of its citizens. Um, Old Republicans kind of felt that the failure was due to laziness, lack of character, that people who failed kind of went back to that idea of social Darwinism. It was because they weren't necessarily of the fittest. So these are the terms that we're going to be looking at as far as lecture wise. It does kind of match up with your textbook. I'll go into a little more in certain areas than maybe than what the book does, and the book will go into areas more in detail than some things that I'll go into. But together, you should get a real good feel this week, kind of on especially Teddy Roosevelt's role with progressivism. So we're going to look at the mugwumps, the anthracite disputes, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, scientific racism, the Roosevelt corollary, the Panama Canal, the Great White Fleet, William Howard Taft, and the Bull Moose Party. It's a lot of information, but like I said in the introduction video, these will be in about 15-minute chunks that you can watch as you have time. So cleaning up politically, the progressive era, they did kind of clean up the most some of the corruption in the cities and state governments. There were not enough politicians to clean it up from coast to coast. There were a few who stand out. The man on the left side of your screen is Robert La Follette, from Dane County, Wisconsin, and he was a reforming governor of Wisconsin. He was elected in 1900. He was awakened to corruption when offered a bribe as a young member of Congress, and he brought reform which he hoped would become a model for the country. In his area, railway and utility companies did go under public control. He created a state income tax, and he did what he could to improve worker circumstances. However, that wasn't always, there's limits on what they can do. The guy on the right side of your screen is Hazen Pingree, and he was from Detroit. He was a governor of Michigan, and he brought corrupt utility companies under public control and helped improve living conditions for his constituents. However, they just simply did not have a large enough platform, so they did what they could in the areas that they could do it in. But this man here, Teddy Roosevelt, he did look at things in a much and did accomplish things in a much larger scale than what some of these mayors and governors were able to do. Teddy Roosevelt, honestly, there are so many interesting things in Teddy Roosevelt's life that it's really difficult to decide what to even talk about. He was incredibly influential in changing the shape of the country after the Gilded Age. And there's no way that I have time to discuss everything that there is about his life. But if you are interested in him, I would certainly suggest watching the Roosevelt miniseries. It's incredibly interesting, the things he accomplished. But he was born to a prominent family. He was never quite comfortable with Gilded Age politics, and he associated with what we call mugwumps, and that is one of your key terms. And a mugwump is a person who remains aloof or independent from politics. So a person who remains aloof or independent from politics. But it was a reform element in the Republican Party. His most significant change earlier in his career came as the police commissioner of New York City. And what he did was he walked the streets with a man by the name of Jacob Riis, which you learned about last week. This part was actually in your chapter last week. And Riis was the author of How the Other Half Lives, and he took Roosevelt around, showed him these people, and Roosevelt was able to see in person the misery of the life in the cities. And it was demonstrated that all levels of government were not interested in the people. But most importantly, he became aware of the enormous disparity between wealthy and poor. Um, so Roosevelt kind of, I mean, if we look at his involvement in Cuba in the 1990s and um, everything, Roosevelt was already somewhat of kind of a celebrity in the United States. So he and his Rough Riders were kind of larger than life individuals, and you'll have to read that part in your book this week. But they really were kind of, and him in particular was kind of set up as a celebrity. And he did. One of the reasons that he became so well known for that was because he did make himself available to reporters. And this is a time period when if you make yourself available to reporters, they will report on you. And so a lot of people knew who he was, knew what he did. And he may have even embellished the story occasionally as to what happened. But by 1900, the Republican Party needed to do something with Roosevelt because of his reform tendencies. And quite honestly, they did not want him to be president of the United States. It was clear that McKinley would be reelected at this time. And the party pressured McKinley to add Roosevelt to the ticket as his vice president. And what they honestly thought, they thought that Roosevelt would disappear in that office. And quite honestly, you want to make somebody ineffective, it was a great way to do so at the time. The two were easily elected in 1900. However, not long after that election, after the March 1901 election, McKinley was assassinated. And the most important thing I want you to remember is that Roosevelt pushed the presidency absolutely to the limits of the Constitution. He demonstrated what the office was capable of when it was not beholden to the rich and powerful. Between 1901 and 1909, he put himself into nearly all corners of social, economic, and international issues. He even put himself into the middle of college football. But Teddy Roosevelt as president, the backstory, by the time he became president, most people knew his story. He had overcome childhood asthma. He had lost his first wife and his mother on Valentine's Day of 1804. When he lost them, he banished himself to the Badlands of North Dakota. He was very much known for his physical strength, his intellectual abilities. He wrote histories. I have one floating around my house somewhere of one of the histories that Roosevelt wrote, and he had absolutely amazing thoughts that were very ahead of his time. And he had instant credibility with the public, and no matter what he did as president, for that time, it was profound. So one of the things that he got himself involved in was the Northeastern Pennsylvania anthracite dispute of 1902. Gilded Age, no government official ever gave workers support when in a dispute with business leaders. I mean, we've looked at some of those things as we've come up to this semester, and there's no government intervention to help workers. The main thing that they would do, they call out the police, call out the National Guard, call out the Pinkerton thugs, but Roosevelt got involved. And the fact that he did not immediately side with industry confounded many. His primary objective was not as much for the Union as it was to make sure that millions of households were not cold for the winter in the anthracite disputes. Because so what happens here is the workers walked out because of the working conditions that they were forced to work in. If you're not sure what anthracite is, it's what you heat your homes with during this time period. And Roosevelt was very concerned that with this dispute that a lot of homes would be without heat. So he says, look, either you guys come to some sort of agreement on this and we have coal to heat these homes with, or I'll send in the military and they will mine the coal. We'll put it under government, I don't care. So what that means is the workers lose their jobs, they're not getting paid, and also if the government takes control of it, then those who own the industry, they don't really make money either. So his primary objective, though, was to make sure that the households were not cold. But this is the first time, and he calls both sides into the White House, and he says, sit down, we're figuring this out. And he says, you can do it, you guys can agree to something, or we'll take it over. And this is the first time that we really see a hardcore union win. Whether or not that was his objective, he was more concerned about people being cold in the winter, but it is the first union win. He was not anti-big business. He did seek to achieve a fair settlement between the two in this. And he didn't intend to follow through. But a resolution favoring the miners was achieved. We will pick up with the Elkins Act in the next video.